Good morning, everyone. Welcome to OHR In Conversation with. Um, my name is Tiana Davis. I am the outreach specialist with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. With me today's co-host is Kyla Hannington, the outreach manager with the Office of Human Rights. The Office of Human Rights is Prince George's County's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. We investigate complaints of discrimination, combat human trafficking, ensure equitable access for all people to county government services in the language of their preference, and provide opportunity for learning and engagement on areas of social justice importance. Um, Today, we are talking to Professor Theoharis about her 2025 book, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life of Struggle Outside of the South, in celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. Day next Monday, January 19th. Jeanne Theoharis is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York. She is the author of New York Times bestselling The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks and winner of the 2014 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work, Biography, Autobiography, and the Little Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. Her book has been adapted into a documentary of the same name, executive produced by Soledad O'Brien for Peacock, where Theoharis served as a consulting producer. Her young adult adaptation with Brandy Colbert, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks for Young People, was included in the Best Books of 2021 by the Chicago Public Library and Kirkus Reviews. Her book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, won the 2018 Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize in Nonfiction and was named one of the best Black history books of 2018 by Black Perspectives. Theoharis's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, Slate, The Atlantic, and many more. She is also the author of King of the North and lives in Brooklyn. Welcome, Jeanne. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you take a few moments to introduce King of the North in your own words?
Thank you so much for having me. So King of the North really began almost 20 years ago. I was on a fellowship in Los Angeles, and I was doing research on the civil rights movement in LA in the decade before Watts. And I was going through the two main Black newspapers of the 1960s, and that's the Los Angeles Sentinel and the California Eagle, to document the movement against LA's segregated schools and segregated housing and police brutality. And I kept finding Dr. King in the city. And here he is speaking out against police brutality in 1962. And here he is joining a march around LA's segregated schools in 63. And here he is talking over and over about how segregated housing is in California. And I realized that I'd bought into kind of the basic narrative of Dr. King, which is that he turns north after Watts erupts in August of 1965. He realizes ostensibly that Northern Black people had been left out, and that's what leads him to do a campaign in Chicago. And that's inaccurate in so many ways, and we'll talk about the many ways today. But fundamentally, just starting in LA, King had been in LA more than 15 times in the decade before Watts, standing with many different movements in the city, and had spoken out repeatedly against the patterns of police brutality and school segregation and housing segregation. And in fact, when we get to the Watts uprising, King will say, basically, if they had listened, there would not be a Watts uprising. Mm. So that very much changes, I think, the way we tell the story of the movement in the 1960s. And that's the beginning of what leads me to King of the North, because once I saw it in LA, I saw it everywhere, right? How much time he spends from Chicago to Boston to Detroit to New York, which are the 5 cities I focus on in the book, but also Milwaukee, Seattle, Baltimore, Tempe, Arizona, San Francisco, Dr. King will spend much of the decade, again, between kind of the Montgomery bus boycott and the Watts uprising, not just kind of supporting and growing movements in the South, but traveling to support movements across the country. He travels 6 million miles, they detail. And I think the other thing that I think King of the North begins to do is we often focus on Dr. King at the front, on the dais. And one of the other gifts of his leadership, when you kind of expand where we look, when you turn the kaleidoscope, is the metaphor I like to use, is that King also understood that part of his leadership was showing up and supporting other people's movements, other people's struggles. And so we can talk more about that today.
Okay. Were you going to say something else?
No, go ahead.
I appreciated that, especially in the early book, a lot of your focus was on Coretta as an individual, like not just
Absolutely.
Dr. King's wife. You talked about her own tenacity, her own intelligence, her own work. Can you talk about the choice to have her mentioned so much in the story of Dr. King?
Right. So I think the first thing to understand is how formidable Coretta Scott King is, and that part of why Martin Luther King falls in love with her is because of that. She's more of an activist than he is when they meet. Just to give people a tiny bit of background, Coretta Scott grows up in outside Marion, Alabama, to a very proud family. They own their own land. Her father has a kind of lumber business. Because of his kind of pride and unrelentingness, the family's home is burned, his business is burned. So from a very early age, she both understands the value of standing up and also the cost you can pay. Her and her older sister go to college at one of maybe the most liberal college in the nation, Antioch College, and they are one of the first Black students to go to Antioch in decades. Antioch's in Ohio. It is both a tremendous experience for Coretta Scott. It opens many opportunities for her. She becomes a political activist. And it also means that she sees that segregation is not a Southern problem, but a national problem. And she will also see, before she meets Dr. King, and he will have similar experiences, that Northern liberals are not so liberal at home. So she is a music and education major. Like, as we know, to major in education, you need to student teach. Antioch is located in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and the Yellow Springs School Board forbids her and any Black student from student teaching in their schools. And Antioch sides with Yellow Springs. And she is just dumbfounded by this. As I mentioned, Antioch is a very political college. Her classmates and her are protesting the Cold War. They're protesting segregation. So she's outraged, and she's going to go to the president of Antioch to protest this. And she tries to get her classmates who are protesting other things to go with her. But they are worried about their own positions. They're worried about their own placements, and no one will join her. And so she goes to protest to the president of Antioch alone. And I think this is a formative experience because she, again, will see how allies can get wobbly when the injustice is sort of in their own backyards. One of the things that she does at Antioch is she becomes active in the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party in 1948 is running a third-party challenge for the U.S. presidency from the left, both challenging segregation and economic injustice at home, but also Cold War militarism abroad. She goes to the Progressive Party convention in 1948, one of about 150 Black people there. It is through the Progressive Party that she meets Paul Robeson. She meets Bayard Rustin. So to put this another way, she knows Robeson and Rustin before she meets Martin Luther King and before he does. So after she graduates, she decides she wants to pursue a vocal career potentially, and she goes to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. Martin Luther King, just to remind us, he goes to Morehouse College, then he goes to Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania, and then he makes the decision to pursue a doctorate at Boston University. And it is through a mutual friend that they meet. And at first, she's not really keen to meet him. Coretta Scott is a deep Christian, but most of the ministers she knew were all about, and this is her words, suits and sanctimony. And to her, being a Christian fundamentally is what you do in your life. She's also, to be able to afford to go to New England Conservatory, she's doing live-in domestic work in Beacon Hill, which is an all-white, very fancy part of Boston at the time. She's not going to church because there's literally barely no Black people around except people doing live-in domestic work. But she agrees to a lunch date with Martin Luther King. They talk about racism, capitalism on their first date, right? Like all good dates. And he's smitten from that very first time. He says to her at the end, you have all the characteristics I want in a wife. You're beautiful, you're smart, you're principled. And she's like, you don't even know me. So one of the things I think when I look at the kind of beginnings of their relationship is how Coretta Scott is going to make Martin Luther King bring his A game. It takes her much longer to fall in love. She both very much appreciates, and this is a quality we don't tend to sort of hear about Dr. King, but I think really important, that Dr. King was a listener and was not judgy. That's one of the things that she most appreciates about him. And then she begins to see this tremendous vision he has, a vision that inspires her, but also makes her see how unlike many ministers he is. And I think they're coming together. I mean, he has gone both to Crozier Seminary and to BU to find a kind of liberationist Christianity ministry. And his mentors, like Howard Thurman at Boston University, are really important to that, but so is Coretta Scott, right? That idea that it is what you do in your life that makes you a Christian. They get married in June of 1953. She refuses to wear white. She does not wear a long dress. She wears a light blue kind of tea-length dress. And she gets her very imposing father-in-law, Dr. King Sr., to take Obey out of their vows, because to her, it makes her feel like an indentured servant. Mm-hmm. This is who Martin Luther King marries in 1953. This is not 1973. This is not 1993. And so I think really seeing their romantic relationship as also always a kind of political and intellectual partnership, I think is really important to the story. And so I think, therefore, so many King biographers talk about so many of King's advisors and quote so many of King's advisors that were certainly important. But one of the arguments I make in the book is that Coretta Scott was certainly one of his key advisors, perhaps his most important advisor. And so we need to hear from her, too, about what he was doing and what their work was over the next, basically 15 years from when they marry to his assassination.
I just want to highlight something for viewers in case it got by you. Talking about racism, capitalism on a first date is a mark of a great first date. And so I just feel like I don't want that to just go by. Like this is, you early on you write in terms of criticizing Northern liberalism, challenging Northern racism, quote, meeting new heroes and reckoning with new villains. Something that we need to do as we criticize Northern liberalism and think about this more fully. And you introduced us to a series of perhaps lesser known names. And so some of them were, I heard James Orange, Rosie Simpson, Ruth Bassett, for example, of people lifted up as heroes. And I'm wondering if you can talk, and you mentioned in your introduction too, the support that King gave to some other figures. And could you highlight some of these people?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest fallacies that sometimes still persists about how we see the civil rights movement is that there was a broad nonviolent movement in the South, but not in the Northeast or Midwest and West Coast. And that is patently false. Mm-hmm. And in fact, alongside and at the same time that we see, for instance, the like Little Rock, Arkansas, and the move to try to desegregate the Central High School in Little Rock in 1957, we have activists in New York City pressing against New York City's segregated schools. And in fact, in 1958, 9 mothers, which will be called the Harlem Nine, will take their kids out of school because those protests have fallen on deaf ears and they don't want the insufficient, unequal education that their kids are getting. Mm-hmm. And those mothers will be brought up on charges for, taking, your kids not getting an education. Ultimately, those charges will be dropped, but the Harlem Nine and one of the key leaders of the Harlem Nine is a woman by the name of May Mallory. She had migrated from the South, but she was astonished to see the kinds of conditions that her kids were being educated in Harlem. In her kids' school, there wasn't even like real plumbing. Like basically the kids were going, this is in, again, the late 1950s in New York City. It was basically there wasn't, they were going to the bathroom and it was just like an outhouse. Like it was just sitting there. And she actually goes to Albany to protest. So May Mallory in New York, right? This really fierce mother activist. In Chicago, King will be so impressed with the movement in Chicago. And in fact, when King makes the decision to partner and to bring SCLC to Chicago, which happens in 65, not 66, it is because he has watched and joined with an incredibly robust movement there, particularly challenging Chicago's segregated schools. And you mentioned Rosie Simpson. Rosie Simpson is a parent activist in Chicago. She is relentless. Just to give you people a sense of the scope of the problem in Chicago. By the mid-60s, there are about 1 million Black people living in Chicago. By 1965, there are more Black people living in Chicago than in the entire state of Alabama.
Oh.
Yeah. And they are being, and the level of school and housing segregation in the city is intense and getting worse. And so Black schools are getting so overcrowded that the school superintendent starts to put them on what is euphemistically called a double session day. What that means is they're cutting the school day for Black students in half so that they can accommodate 2 different groups of students. One group of students goes for 4 hours in the morning. They leave. Then the next group of students. So basically, many tens of thousands of Black students in Chicago by the early 60s are only going to school for 4 hours a day. When that's not enough, instead of, there are open seats all across the school, the city, in white schools. But the superintendent and school officials in Chicago, and this is true in Boston or in LA or New York, I'm just talking about Chicago, are constantly drawing the zoning lines to keep Black schools Black. And so what that means in a city like Chicago is then they start buying these really expensive, what are basically like trailer classrooms and putting them like in parking lots and stuff outside of Black schools. And parents are outraged. And Rosie Simpson, right, first she's like trying to sort of talk to kind of local school officials, and then they have pickets, and then they start doing like protests where they're like laying down in front of like construction vehicles that are trying to bring these trailers in, right? It's this really like sort of forceful movement. Over 2,500 Chicagoans will go to the March on Washington in 1963. Again, I think when you look, again, if we're using this kaleidoscope metaphor of, changing our view, right? We often think about the March on Washington and don't think about who goes to the March on Washington, right? 2,500 Chicagoans, and they're like carrying signs all about like Superintendent Willis must go and stop segregated schools in Chicago. And King is really impressed by the level of organization, by the level of protest, and also sickened by the ways that there is such resistance in Chicago. He will say, if this had been a city in the South, change would have happened. In part because what you just mentioned, Kyla, which is that we have by the late 50s and early 60s, Northern liberals who are increasingly pushing for change in the South, saying segregation is not okay in the South. But I think one of the things we've missed is some of those very same people, not all, but some, are the very people who are then trying to protect and defend segregation when it comes to their own schools, their own jobs, their own housing, right? And so that double voicedness, where there can be a growing clamor against Southern segregation, doesn't necessarily translate to having desegregated schools in cities like LA or Chicago or many others.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about that cognitive dissonance, right? Because ahead of the Kings moving to Chicago, in your book, you talk about how the landlords are like, they heard that the Kings were coming and they fixed up these apartments really quickly so that the
Yep.
Kings didn't see, you know, how bad things were. But some of these same people were so adamant that there was no segregation, which is
Absolutely.
wild because in 2026, major cities are still segregated. DC,
Absolutely.
Baltimore, Boston, like you mentioned earlier, still segregated, right? So what do you think causes that dissonance?
Well, I mean, I think we want to talk about a few things, right? The United States in the 50s and 60s is engaged, right, in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And US kind of segregation and race relations are in many ways like also have an international component to them, right? And absolutely the Soviet Union is using US race relations to try to undercut sort of US claims for democracy. And one of the things we want to remember is this is also a period of kind of anti-colonial independence movements across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And the United States is very invested in trying to get those sort of countries, newly independent countries, not to side with the Soviet Union. So US race relations are in some ways held up to world scrutiny. But the view the United States wants on this is a view that what racism and segregation is in the United States is a regional leftover and aberration, right? And so what we'll see, and scholars like Mary Duziak have documented this sort of very extensively, is by the late 50s and early 60s, the United States is showcasing some of the movements in the South, in part to show kind of the robustness of US democracy, that look, in our democracy, we can fix our own problems and we acknowledge injustice. But seeing it in New York, seeing it in Chicago, seeing it in Boston, seeing it in Baltimore or DC, that starts to say this is not a regional aberration or a leftover from a previous time. That's like a national cancer. Mm-hmm. So there is both a kind of investment in, again, seeing it as a Southern problem. I think the second thing that makes challenging Northern segregation hard is what, Tiana, you just mentioned, which is the sort of gaslighting nature of the ways that segregation is being defended in cities like New York, Chicago, LA. And again, I'm talking about these five because those are the main, but we could talk about many others. Which is, for instance, New York superintendent in the wake of the Brown decision praises the Brown decision, but it's like, I don't know if this really applies to us, and instructs New York City school officials, don't use the word segregation, use the word separation or racially imbalanced, right? To make it seem like it just sort of naturally happens, that there's not a systemic problem. We will see school officials over and over and over make the argument that, oh, people just like to live with their own. We don't have school segregation here. And this has been perpetuated in our textbooks, right? You know, this distinction we often see in textbooks where it says de facto and de jure. Mm-hmm. That is not a real distinction. That's an ideological distinction. And it's an ideological distinction that in many ways comes, like that word de facto is a post-Brown decision kind of way of thinking about segregation to basically say Northern segregation is not the same. And to try to mask the way that it is absolutely sewn into law and policy from the Northeast to the West Coast. But it is done so in somewhat different ways, right? Because of that, we don't have segregation, right? So you will have school officials again, which is different than in the South. So it's not like everything's the same. In the South, particularly what we could see in the late 50s, early 60s, is you have many more officials being willing to defend segregation on its face. What you have in the North is, again, the use of different words. It's not segregation, it's racial imbalance. We didn't create it. It's not, it's not our fault. And then a way that, and I should step back and say, one of the big arguments in King of the North is an argument about the role of the media.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is very important because similarly, the mainstream media, big national media, and again, we could think both of, and I focus on the print media in the book, outlets like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, but other scholars have also focused on TV media, and Matthew Delmont is one who does this very well. Will, by, again, the early 60s, start to shine a light on Southern segregation and some of the movements in the South that are challenging it, right? The student sit-ins, the freedom rides, the movement in Birmingham, right? And you will have people like Congressman John Lewis talk about how they would have been a bird without a song if the media hadn't shined a light.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that has then made us not see that even as that national media is paying more serious attention to what's happening in the South and covering those movements seriously and rigorously, at the very same time, they are treating movements in New York, in Boston, in Chicago very differently. They see them as unreasonable. They see them as un-American. The New York Times will call the biggest civil rights protest in the history of the 60s is not the March on Washington, but in February of 1964, Black parents and community activists, frustrated by a kind of decade after Brown, and New York City schools are still, there's not even a plan for desegregation, basically have a school boycott, and nearly 500,000 students and teachers stay out of New York City schools on February 3rd, 1964, to protest the lack of even a plan. The New York Times calls this unreasonable, calls this reckless, calls this violent. Nothing violent about it. There's no damage to people or to property, but it is profoundly disruptive. It is meant to be disruptive. It is meant to cost the city money, right, because of attendance. So one of the things that I had to do to be able to write this book was to look at the ways that we have trusted, particularly with Dr. King, the way the media was framing him. And in fact, the way that, for instance, the LA Times frames King when he's in LA is very different from how they're covering, Birmingham or St. Augustine, Florida, and these struggles in the South. And so it required kind of analyzing and looking at the kinds of ideas that then get perpetuated, that then have become sewn into many of our textbooks, many of our histories of the movement and of Dr. King himself. I could not have written this book without the Black press, because I told you that story about LA, right? The Black press is covering Dr. King in all these cities very differently, much more fulsomely. So one of the tactics that the media uses often when King is closer to home is the New York Times, the LA Times, they will ignore him in, the early 60s, or they will say, oh, he's giving a speech here, but not really cover, or they'll give a quote and they'll say, King is saying that LA is as segregated as Birmingham, but then they won't actually do what they do in the South, which is then back that statement up. Why is King saying that? So I wouldn't have been able to do this book without kind of looking at, and one of the great things that's happened over the past, 15, 20 years is many of the major Black newspapers are now digitalized. And this is what I've been talking about, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News, the Chicago Defender, the LA Sentinel. And so to be able to look at like a decade's worth of coverage and then to see, like I did in LA, King there over and over and over, but also what those local movements are doing and the reactions of the city and how different that coverage looks like than the way it shows up in, you know, mainstream white newspapers like the LA Times or the New York Times.
So I did my undergraduate degree in history, and one of the things that I learned is that, you know, and understood that knowing history, learning about history helps us understand the present. It's such an important study because we get to make sense of where we are right now. And so I'm wondering, as I'm listening to you talking right now about media, about what's covered, what's not covered, about ways things are spun or you know, you use the word fulsome, that some reports are more fulsome than others. How are you seeing this play out today? I mean, I'm trying to not ask a leading question, which is why I pause. I'm trying to find a way to phrase it where I'm not saying that it is or isn't, but just how are you finding it?
I mean, I think a couple of things, right? I think if we go back to the media, right? The media gets a lot of credit for the civil rights movement, right? And the ways that they, you know, kind of, to use a sports metaphor, kind of bring the ball down the field, right? And that in many ways, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, right? That we don't get that without. But I think that then makes it seem like the media is a real check on government power, on racial injustice. That if you have a movement against injustice, it will be taken seriously. And I think looking again at Dr. King, because I think one of the things about Dr. King is he's the same person. He speaks the same way. He wears the same suits, right, in Birmingham as in Chicago. So in many ways, it's interesting because I think one of the things we see today often is Dr. King being rolled out against contemporary movements, against young activists. Why aren't you more like Dr. King, right? If you dress nicely, if you speak eloquently, if you protest in the right way, your protest will be heard. And I think one of the sobering things when you start to look at Dr. King, again, outside of the South, you look at movements outside of the South, the media, more often than not, is saying you're not doing it the right way. You're being unreasonable. You're being un-American. That same beautiful voice in that same well-dressed suit is seen very differently, right? He becomes an outside agitator when he's talking about Chicago, in Chicago. He becomes an outside agitator when he goes to LA in the wake of the uprising and tells the mayor and tells the police chief, like, you have a real problem. You have a pattern of police brutality. You have a pattern of school and housing segregation. They're like, get out of here. I mean, literally, right? Yorty will say to the press, King shouldn't have come. He did the city a disservice. 6 months earlier, the mayor's giving King a key to the city. You're always welcome here, right? So again and again, and this feels very familiar to today, right? This sense of you're being unreasonable. You don't know, right? Or why are you disrupting things? Another myth that I think, again, when we see, and often, we will see this in the way the holiday is often celebrated. And again, the way that Dr. King is, as my students call him, being used as the ultimate gaslight against kind of young activists today is this notion that you don't make things, King didn't inconvenience people. King didn't disrupt things. It's like, what King are you talking about? That fundamentally, Dr. King understood that the point of direct action was to disrupt things because injustice was comfortable, right? That if we even start with the Montgomery bus boycott, what is the Montgomery bus boycott? It is a disruptive consumer boycott. It is meant to hurt the bus company and hurt the city. Because without that, things just went along as they did. So these kinds of tactics, I think sometimes we have a very sepia tone, very like, it's all about sitting at lunch counters, and we don't even have lunch counters really now. So the kind of nonviolence, the kind of direct action that they're doing, right, is about, right? It's about boycotts. It's about rent strikes. It's about school boycotts. It's about disrupting traffic in city life. Again, to say this is a deep injustice and this needs to be, I mean, King will talk about bringing the tension, bringing the injustice to the surface, because too many people want it not on the surface. So this idea that King did inconvenience people, or that you just ask nicely, and if you ask nicely, that will happen, that's just not even an accurate history of what the Southern movement looks like. So I think one thing, as we kind of get to next week, and the ways that King is often distorted, and King is often used as some sort of like American mascot, when like throughout his life, he was treated as a problem. And that people could kind of love him and hate him in the same moment. So you have Northern mayors both like wanting to have pictures with him when he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and at the same time basically being like, shut up, when he says, when he's talking about what change needs to happen in their cities. So the same way that the King Day is often distorted is happening to Martin Luther King in his own lifetime.
So I know we're here to talk about Dr. King and celebrate, his day coming up. But something that I loved, both in the book and in researching your other work while prepping for this, is you talk a lot about how women were pushed to the side in the civil rights movement as a whole. Yep. Meanwhile, they're giving these great speeches. They want to be on the front lines marching. I think you said Coretta herself raised $50,000. And then, of course, you had Rosa Parks, and you actually wrote an article. I forgot what press it was in, but it was about what everyone's getting wrong about Rosa Parks.
For sure.
Can you talk about the women being left out of the civil rights movement, particularly in leadership positions?
So, I mean, Rosa Parks is my other favorite person to talk about, obviously, beside the Kings. So I wrote a book on Rosa Parks, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, that, as you mentioned in that very nice intro, I also did a young adult version of it. And we also then have a documentary, which is available on Peacock by the same name, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And again, I think one of the ways that we honor people, because again, I think most people listening today know Rosa Parks, they know Coretta Scott King, but we often narrow them, we often shrink them, and that at times was how their contributions were also treated in the movement itself, right? So at the March on Washington, no women get to speak. A number of women like Rosa Parks get to stand up and be recognized. She's dumbfounded by this. Coretta Scott King protests it. Other women protest it. But if we take somebody like Rosa Parks, right, we have reduced her to that one day on the bus. She's the bus lady. When Rosa Parks is actually an activist for her entire life. The title of my book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, actually is taken from something she says, which is that she has a life history of being rebellious. Mm-hmm. Her words, which begins more than 2 decades before her bus stand. Then after the successful end of the Montgomery bus boycott, she gets fired during the boycott. Her husband loses his job. They never find steady work again. They're getting death threats. So 8 months after the boycott's successful end, they are forced to leave Montgomery. They move to Detroit, where her brother is and her cousins are. She will describe Detroit as the northern promised land that wasn't. And she will spend the next 40 years sort of continuing that work, kind of challenging the segregation of her new hometown. Rosa Parks, like the Kings, has a kind of global vision. And so she will be an early opponent of the war in Vietnam. She will be an early challenger of South African apartheid, again, like Coretta Scott King. She's very active in Black Power. She's everywhere. People told me reparations, anti-police brutality, welfare rights, all of these different things. But again, the way I think we often honor people and honor Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King is also to like make them small and make them quiet and not see the kind of like the expanse of their politics, the range of issues that they are committed to. Again, both Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King really seeing kind of global justice and justice at home being kind of inextricable. But I think in some ways the way we honor them replicates some of the sexism in the movement. So, for instance, the very first mass meeting, the very first night of the boycott, right? And we want to remember, so Rosa Parks makes her bus stand on a Thursday. She's coming home from work. She actually sits in the middle. She doesn't sit in the front. The middle is what she would call a no man's land. Black people are allowed to sit there, but by the whim of the driver, sometimes are forced to move. About 3 stops after she gets on, she's coming home from work. She works at a segregated department store, which means she basically spends her days tailoring white men's suits. She works in the men's shop. As she would put it, making it easy and clever for white people. She's coming home from work. And about 3 stops after she gets on, the bus fills up and there's one white man left standing. And by the terms of Alabama segregation, so she's sitting here, there's a black man sitting next to her and 2 black women across the aisle. All 4 of them will have to get up so that one white person can sit down. She says the first time the bus driver asks, no one moves. She says the second time he gets more threatening, and reluctantly, the 3 other people get up, but she thinks to her, the bus driver actually says, you all better make it light on yourselves, right? He sort of threatens. She's like, this is not making it light on ourselves as a people. She says she thinks about Emmett Till, right? The 14-year-old who had been lynched and whose killers had recently been acquitted. She'd actually been at a mass meeting 4 nights earlier about the acquittal of the 2 men. She says she thinks about her grandfather. She says she thinks about if she got up, she would be approving of that treatment, and she did not approve. And so she doesn't get up. So as we know, she's arrested and she decides late that night that she's going to pursue her legal case. And she calls a young black lawyer, 25-year-old black lawyer in town who she'd become friends with through the NAACP, Fred Gray, that night to ask him to represent her. And later that night, he calls Joanne Robinson, who is the head of the Women's Political Council, which is a women's political kind of group in Montgomery. And it is the Women's Political Council who calls for a boycott on Monday, which is the day that Parks will be arraigned in court. So originally they call for a 1-day boycott. Their leaflets say, and then in the middle of the night, Joanne Robinson, who's a professor at Alabama State, basically goes to the college and with the help of a colleague and 2 students, runs off on the mimeograph machine 35,000 leaflets that say, another woman has been arrested on the bus, boycott on Monday. So it's the women who basically get this boycott in motion. And everyone's nervous, right? A lot of longtime activists like the Parks family are nervous that weekend. Will people actually stay off? And they do. And that Monday night, there is a big mass meeting. King speaks. King is 26 years old. We want to remember that. King is so young. Most of the other ministers are too scared to speak. He speaks. Rosa Parks doesn't get to speak that night. There are calls, like she gets a standing ovation that night. There are calls for her to speak. She doesn't get to speak, right? So I think we see these kinds of ideas about, Joanne Robinson doesn't get to speak. So the ways that women's leadership, the ways that women's organizing, right, at the time is both essential and at times marginalized. And that unfortunately, sometimes we've replicated that in the ways that we honor these women, right? So Parks gets sort of fixed on the bus. Coretta Scott King just becomes this like helpmate to Dr. King. And, you know, and there are many, many sort of books that have come out in the past, like 15 years that seek to change that, right? So we have amazing biographies of Ella Baker, of Septima Clark, of Fannie Lou Hamer, of Florence Kennedy, right? And the list goes on. So we're beginning to see a real literature for people who are interested in reading about kind of women in the movement. Now we've begun to really correct that.
I have a lot of things I want to talk about, and I'm looking at the time and realizing that we're like getting a little pinched on time. So I'm going to try to prioritize two things, and then I'll give it back to you, Tiana. So priority number one is, I was wondering if you've talked. I put a link. So first of all, viewers, and whether you're watching live or you're joining us on demand later, we are putting links right now in the live chat feed. So if you're watching on demand later, click that live chat feed, and you're going to get some links for the King of the North, as well as I just put in a link for the rebellious life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And what I was hoping you could do is just talk a little bit in more detail for us, Dr. Theoharis, about all of the many things that are surrounding that book. You know, I know we've talked a little bit about it, but there's a film, there's a teaching guide. Can you just like lay it out for viewers, like what there is to draw from the rebellious life of Mrs. Rosa Parks?
Yeah, thank you. So, we did the young adult, and so there, if you go to buy it, there's both you know, the original adult version, and we brought an anniversary edition out last year. There's also there's also a second book that's called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks for young people. That's basically kind of for kids 12 and up. Is being used in schools, you know, junior high schools, high schools. But when we got to do the documentary, we got a grant from the Ford Foundation to build a curriculum. And what Kyla just put in the chat is a link to that curriculum. So to make it easier for teachers to use the film, to use the YA, because again, Rosa Parks's sort of life of activism kind of shows us a lot of the kind of varied movement, both that begins in the 1930s, right? So to get that early history, obviously it gets us out of the South. So we both get to see Montgomery, but also Detroit. We get to see the fight for a more just criminal justice system. So anti-police brutality, the kind of ways that the law is the over-incarceration of Black people. And also a set of lessons that are about critical thinking. Because I think one of the things that I find in my classroom is when you talk about kind of how Rosa Parks was introduced to you, maybe in middle school or high school, and then what this fuller history shows us, it's a great lesson in kind of critical thinking and kind of why we get the histories we get or the memorials we get. And so getting students to kind of think about representation. So there are a number of critical thinking lessons there as well. So the link has a number. We basically built a curriculum suite. I had a team of educators working with me. So that's what's at that link. And again, the film is on Peacock and it's streaming, so you can watch it in your classroom or with friends or with your community organization. So we have we have a lot, you know, we have a full wraparound. We are going to have for the King holiday our first, you know, kind of lesson around King of the North, kind of looking at the movement here in New York. And that's also, it's an education project. And so if you go to their website, you'll be able to see that as well. Again, the Rosa Parks curriculum is with an education project.
Well, so thank you for that. And so I just want to highlight again for people listening, if you missed that, the film, you can watch the film on Peacock. If you have Peacock, or if you have a friend who has Peacock, you can check it out. And please go through these links and learn more about all of these amazing things that Dr. Theoharis is talking about. And I said I had two things. So my second thing, and you know, you've talked about it a couple times, and you highlighted, you know, that sometimes, like, not only is Martin Luther King's legacy misremembered, I'm trying to think of the right word, but also you used some language earlier just around sometimes the way the holiday is yes. celebrated. Yes. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about is like, how here we are, we're a week out, the Martin Luther King weekend is coming up. It's mm-hmm. you know, how can people, what should people focus and put their energies into to really honor the activism and the effort of Dr. Martin Luther King.
So going back to our conversation about direct action, right? I think sometimes the way that the holiday plays out is this like day of service, clean up your neighborhood, like go to a soup kitchen, right? And those are important things. But what I want to stress is that King was about direct action. One of my favorite quotes, sometimes Dr. King just is so like, one of nice kind of liberal white woman in Chicago. Why don't Black people just clean up their own neighborhoods? And he's like, ma'am, that's the job of sanitation, right? No amount of cleaning up your neighborhood, if you're not getting equal sanitation services, is going to change the problem. So one of the things I want us to remember as we go into the King holiday, right, is his attention to policy, to structures, that it's not just about like, he has, and I'm not going to get his quote, but it's not just about giving a coin to a beggar. It's about changing the edifice that produces beggars, right? Mm-hmm. So part of approaching the weekend, right, is that if we are going to honor him and if we are going to honor Coretta Scott King, they were direct action people. They stood in the way of injustice over and over. They were scared. I think one of the other things we kind of take out of the story, and it's sort of a Hollywood way of thinking about fear, is that somehow you're scared and then you push past the fear and then you get to the other side. No. Studying both Parks and then the Kings now, part of their, if we're going to call it, like one of the key, to use the young people's term, superpowers, right, is their ability to move and move again in the midst of fear. They don't get past fear. They are able to move even when they're afraid. They're able to do things even when they're afraid, right? And so as we get to this weekend and the kind of injustices we are seeing across the country, part of what I think the Kings call us to do is to stand in the way of injustice. We cannot have business as usual. And when we reduce it to a day of service, that's a little bit business as usual. One other thing, I think another way that we often misuse Dr. King is that beautiful, right? The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And we often use that to sort of make it seem like King just thinks the United States is just progressing, and maybe slowly, but progressing. When the actual Dr. King spoke out repeatedly against this idea of the myth of time, right? That things are slowly, inexorably getting better. No. I think part of what he is doing with that, the arc of the universe is long, is a reminder of where God sits, right? That we have a God that sits on the side of injustice. But he is very clear that time is neutral. And he repeatedly says that people using it for evil are often doing it more effectively. And so he is very clear that it is only with our own actions that sort of change will come, that progress will come. And that in fact and Rosa Parks talks about this, the kind of all the forces that kind of work against that, right? So that the need to be steadfast, the need to continue, right? Rosa Parks to the end of her life is saying, do not say the movement is dead, right? Keep struggling. So I think we need to be very careful as, again, with the King holiday and the ways that we often honor Dr. King of sometimes I think defacing what he actually stood for, and what he calls us to do in this moment.
I have a question about how exactly you go about being able to write a biography, especially about a historical figure.
Mhm.
My first job, I was working at a production company that creates like interactive museum exhibits. And my first project was supposed to be something having to do with Dr. King, and that got canceled for reasons. But one thing that I remember is I was a PA, and so I was getting this archival footage. And this one website that we were getting footage from, you know, they would not license this footage to us until they received proof that we were working with the Dr. King or the King family, and that we had permission to be using the footage in the way that we were going to be using it. And we, of course, provided it, and it was all fine. But so I was wondering, like, did you work with the King family, or did you have to get permission, or how did that work?
I did not work with the King family, in part because we weren't talking about licensing like footage or full speeches. Absolutely, this would not have been possible without some key things. One, as I mentioned, the Black press, right? So the kind of level of detail that in the Black press about what King is doing, right, helped me to tell a different story than many other biographers have. The second thing is many scholars and historians and community activists in the past 20 years have also started to document movements, again, across the country, not just in the South. And so in many ways, this book stood on their shoulders, right? People had done oral histories. People had done all sorts of work documenting, for instance, the movement in Chicago, had done many interviews. And so this book would not have been possible without all of that work. And I certainly wouldn't have been able to do it 20 years ago. Third is the kind of who you ask and who you consider a source on Dr. King, right? And we talked about how Coretta Scott King is a big source for me. But also one of my favorite parts in the book, and we haven't talked about this yet, in terms of Chicago, is King's like deep work with gangs and gang members and gang leaders. And how committed he was, how he saw and kind of worked to cultivate those young men as kind of potential community leaders and community activists, how much time he spends there. And I'd started to see this like in lots of kind of the Black press at the time and some of the interviews people had done. And then I decided to write to the head of the Blackstone Rangers, which was one of Chicago's biggest gangs, is still incarcerated. And I wrote to him in prison, and he wrote me back some just lovely letters, like detailing their work with Dr. King. But in the second letter, he said, "No one's ever asked me this." And it's like, oh, yeah, right. So the story we're going to tell is going to be based on who we think an expert on Dr. King is, right? So this is Jeff Fort. Mr. Fort had all sorts of detail about what King's work with the Blackstone Rangers in particular and gangs in Chicago and what the Chicago Freedom Movement looked like. But no one had ever asked him, right? Even though Jeff Fort had been interviewed zillions of times and was like obviously also pigeonholed as this, you're a gang leader, you're this. So the notion that he should be someone we talk to about Martin Luther King, and therefore that we have a different picture because of it. Because like we were talking about a few minutes ago, one of the things that most struck me in Mr. Fort's descriptions was what a listener Dr. King was with these gang members. How he didn't interrupt them, how he didn't, it wasn't, I think if we imagine what King is like in those circumstances, I think we too often think of him as like some sort of finger waving, like just say no. And that's not how he was. They disagreed with him, sometimes profoundly, right? And he stayed and they kept talking, and he saw them as experts on what was happening in the city and people to figure out where, how they should move together, right? So I think that also, in terms of telling this history, is sort of who you ask and where you look.
All right. So I think we are just about at time.
Yeah.
Professor Theoharis, thank you so much for joining us today. To everyone watching, whether live or on demand later, thank you for tuning in as well. You are why we do what we do. The best way to support Jeanne Theoharis is by purchasing King of the North or The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks from your
Yeah.
favorite independent bookseller. If you're not in the position to buy right now, you can also borrow from your local library. Um, Please join us again on Monday, February 3rd at 9 a.m. We will be talking with Doris Sarumi, the town manager of the historic Fairmont Heights in Prince George's County. She will be highlighting some of the incredible civil rights leaders and history of Fairmont Heights. Thank you all again for joining us, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.